Oh, hi. Welcome back to the continuing lecture in macro, ROI, and macroeconomy. Now, so in our last video, we talked about why inflation is important and why it is not necessarily a bad thing. And I said, two. I used um, I gave you two examples of inflation. One, uh, in which case the uh, inflation is caused by sudden increase in money supply, which is relatively rare. Uh, and two, a second case, which is more normal case of inflation, and in which case the inflation is caused by the strong demand in the economy. And as I told you, strong demand is a good thing. It's a sign of a vibrant economy, right? The economy is growing, and if the economy is growing, your income is growing because uh, the output of the economy is the income unto itself. So as the income grows, your spending grows. And if the spending grows, that is, clearly uh, the sign that the as the income grows, it will push up the price level, right? Um, Strong demand pushes up the price level. So um, this is the most common case of inflation, and this is been a good inflation, right? Uh, this type of inflation is necessary, right? But again, uh, extremely, you know, uh, uh, high inflation is not a good thing. Uh, it happens, that's called accelerated inflation. It happens at the end of the business cycle, expansionary cycle. Now, but generally, about 2% inflation is considered moderate and good for the economy. And that's not my saying, that's the target inflation level set by the Federal Reserve. Now, then, but 2% is also kind of empirical pick. I mean, from the empirical, uh, it's the empirical result. I mean, there is no absolute reason to uh, to justify 2%. I mean, absolute or theoretical reason, but empirically it is 2%. But if we didn't know that, um, and since I already said inflation is not necessarily a bad thing, and then what is a bad inflation or what is a good inflation? Now let's think about it this way. As I said, the economy, inflation is an inevitable companion. I mean, it's inevitable companion to economic growth, as there is no way economy can grow without inflation, because growing economy would entail uh, increase the spending, and increased spending will entail price level, higher price level. So we can think about two factors here. First, G, and what does G mean? Growth rate. Okay, in this case, you're familiar with G from the first session. Uh, Growth rate of the economy, right? And with the growth of the economy, inflation is inevitable. So then there can be three scenarios. What are those three scenarios? One, growth rate of the economy is greater than the inflation. Two, growth rate of the economy is equal to inflation. Three, growth rate of the economy is less than the inflation. Now, think about it. Isn't it quite obvious? We don't want this. We don't want you need a cursor. I don't think you can see the cursor, but we don't want growth rate to be less than the inflation, right? This is like this. If growth rate is 10%, the economy is 10%, right? Growth rate of the economy is 10%, and the inflation is 5%. That means everybody's income on average, right? If the economy grew by 10%, that means on average, everybody's income is 10% higher on average. Then spending will go up on average by 10%, right? Whether, I mean, it may not go up exactly by 10%, but people can spend more. Because people do not, just because their income went up by 10%, they don't spend all that 10% on consumption. I mean, they may be spending 5% of it and save 5%, right? But anyway, if income goes up, your paycheck goes up by 10%, price level goes up by 5%, still, what does that mean? You are 5% better off than last year, right? So in this case, nobody even sees the inflation. Nobody even perceives any inflation, right? Now, even in this case, let's say they are both the same, 10%, 10%. So what is this? Nominally, your paycheck is 10% greater. If you were making, $10,000 last year, this year you're making $11,000, and everything is 10% more expensive. So a bottle of water is $1.10 now. You can still buy 10,000 bottles of water. So you don't necessarily feel, I mean, nominally your income is 10% greater, but you cannot buy 10% more, but you don't feel necessarily worse off, right? You don't feel better off, but you don't feel worse off because your living standards are still maintained as, at the same level as last year. So you won't complain. But in this case, think about it. Your paycheck, your income grew 10%, but the inflation is 15%. Then how would you feel? I mean, your income is now $11,000, so it's 10% more than last year, but you are 5% worse off than last year. Well, what would you do? You will cry out inflation. This is clearly a bad case of inflation, bad case. But in this case, this is a good case, right? Or benign case of inflation. Why? You're still 5% better off than last year, right? Your income is 10% more nominally, but in real terms, it is not really 10% better, but still in real terms, you're still 5% better off. Okay, so don't you see this is like the real interest rate also, it's a parallel between the real interest rate, nominal interest rate relationship, economic growth, inflation, right? There's a parallel between these two. So we come to the conclusion that real means, adjust for inflation. Real means, basically nominal adjusted for inflation, right? And then let me erase this. And so back to the Fisher equation, approximated Fisher equation, right? So we come to this conclusion. Now this is something We spent almost, like 3 videos on this. Real interest rate is, by now you should, real interest rate, you should understand what, you can paraphrase this. This means real interest rate is nominal interest rate adjusted for inflation. That's exactly how it can be read, right? Now, another thing. Now this means with moderate level of inflation, something like 2%, right? With moderate level of inflation, with something like 2%, right? Real interest rate always, is smaller than the nominal interest rate. And as this goes up, right, then from the borrower's perspective, it becomes more favorable to borrow because you will be paying back in real terms much less than what you could even pay back in real terms, much less than what you actually borrowed. For example, what if the nominal interest rate was 5%? You borrowed $10,000 for 5%, but there was a 10% inflation. What's going to be the real interest rate? 5%. Some people, if you say 5%, some people would just simply say 5%. It cannot be 5%. You can't you do the math? Huh? I mean, anyone who can do the math will know this is negative 5%, right? So what does that mean? If the real interest rate is negative 5%, that means you are actually receiving interest for borrowing money. Isn't that right? Positive interest rate is what? What does that mean? If you borrow money, you pay interest. That's 10% interest or 5% interest. That's positive interest. You pay because you're the borrower. But if you're paying negative 5% interest, what does that mean? Negative is the opposite of the positive. So instead of paying interest, you are actually receiving interest. So what does that mean? Because nominally you'll be paying back, if this is the case, nominally you're paying back $10,500, but because of the purchasing power of value of money. I mean, when people like to use the term value of money, but what does value of money actually mean? Value of money means purchasing power of money. Isn't that right? So, although nominally you pay back $10,500, but because the purchasing power of $10,500 is 10% lower, much, so it will be even less than $10,000. In other words, the principal that you owe. So you're actually paying back in real terms less than what you owe. So that's why this is a wonderful news for the borrower. You're paying back less than what you owe. So to calculate it correctly, think about it. It is like this. What is adjusting for inflation, right? Nominally 10,500, but the inflation was 10%. So if you divide this by 1.1, that's from the Fisher equation. You remember why we are doing this, right? To make adjustment for that inflation, right? So then it's 10,500. I mean, you can use, your calculator to do this. One is like, this comes to 9,005. Oh, uh, 9,000. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. 9,545.05. So, in terms of real purchasing power, you're paying back less than what you owed. This is what, you know, uh, the meaning of real interest rate is. I mean, if, of course, you might wonder, how realistic is this? I mean, how can it really happen? I mean, um, how is it likely to happen? When it may be hard to happen when interest rate is very high, like 15%. Back in 1985, I told you the benchmark interest rate was, and what is the benchmark interest rate in the U.S.? Benchmark interest rate for short term is Fed funds rate, and for long term is 10-year Treasury note. Well, we're going to come back to this later. Um, if benchmark interest rate is like 15%, this can hardly happen. I mean, of course, it will, whatever inflation is there, and we don't want very high inflation, about 2%, anyway. Still, it will reduce the real interest rate. But these days, what is the benchmark interest rate? Almost 0%, 0.25%. Now think about it. Even 1% inflation will induce negative real interest rate, right? What is this? This is the signal for the potential borrowers to borrow. And why do they, in other words, who wants you to borrow? The Federal Reserve wants you to borrow. Why? If not for just, nobody, if you borrow, they won't even give you the money, they won't lend you the money if you're borrowing just to spend on, nightlife, bars, clothing and things like that. If you borrow money to expand the business, right? But think about it. Uh, what is the reason for that? I mean, if you expand your business, it creates the positive feedback to the economy, right? That's why. Now, then, so our next and we're this is something that and there is these days you may have heard of negative interest rate, and there has been, and they've been saying some European countries have been uh, implementing negative interest rate, and Japan has, and I believe UK has dabbled with but European Union they have UK has dabbled with a negative interest rate, but European Union it says they they cannot act as a single country because they are under one central bank called European Central Bank. So monetary for there cannot be different monetary policy for the for different countries. Um, but the idea is if they talk the, all this talk about negative interest rate uh, is and when they talk about negative interest rate, that's nominal interest rate. They are trying to make the nominal interest rate negative, which is really, really crazy. I mean, that means there's no reason for anybody to put their money in the bank already, but then they are trying to make you put that money into, rather than putting into a bank, earning 0% interest or negative interest, right? They would rather want you to put that money into a stock market or bond market, or lend that money. So already by lending, you are to the bank, you are making 0% or negative. I mean, they haven't, in the U.S. they haven't yet implemented negative interest rate. But if they do, I mean, nobody will keep their money in the bank, right? It's like you're paying to keep your money in the bank, right? You're paying interest to keep your money in the bank. So, but then, in reality, for most realistic, for all practical and realistic reasons, the lowest the nominal interest rate can go down to is 0. Okay. Now, so this brings us to the question of, let me go to, okay. So you see the slide now. So as I said, the benchmark interest rate in the U.S. is the Fed funds rate in the for short term, right? Short term means less than 1 year. For long term interest rate is 10-year Treasury bond. When I say long term interest rate, it sounds like also the interest rate for 10 years. No, I'm not talking about the 10-year holding period. No matter what, always interest rate is annualized, right? So long-term interest rate means annualized, rate for lending money for long term, right? In the short, and also in the short-term money market, I said, short-term, market, the benchmark rate is Fed funds rate, and the Fed funds rate? The name, from the name, Fed funds rate, it sounds like it's the Federal Reserve who sets this rate. It's yes and no. Actually, the answer is yes and no. Let me get to that a little later, right, shortly. But first of all, Fed funds rate is the short for federal funds rate, federal funds market rate. But because the name is federal funds market, it sounds like, does it have something supervised, regulated by the Federal Reserve? No, actually, federal funds market is not directly regulated or supervised. It may be regulated, but it's not like supervised by the Federal Reserve. In other words, Federal Reserve is not the owner of the Fed funds market. Fed funds market is simply an online marketplace for the commercial banks to lend and borrow from each other. Okay? So it's like this. Now, suppose the commercial banks can borrow from each other and lend to each other through federal funds market. And since it is like an online system, you can just if Bank A needs to borrow $1 million from another bank, then they will search for willing lenders on the Fed funds system, and then anyone who anyone who is willing to uh, but the rate at which, because they are borrowing, the rate at which they are borrowing is very competitive. I mean, it's not widely different, right? They are all banks, right? So um, between the banks, they all borrow and lend at a very preferential rate, a very low rate, like 0% these days. Um, but to explain this, let me switch back to, I don't know why I came back to the slide too soon, because, I will still need this whiteboard. So let me go back to the whiteboard. So let's do a little thought experiment. Okay. So suppose there's bank A. There's bank B. And let's say one day, Mr. X comes to bank A and he wants to borrow $1 million. Okay. And Mr. X happens to have a very, very good credit rating. He's what you call prime borrower, prime client. In other words, excellent credit score. He's got like 850 credit score. So he's a very, very credit-worthy, safe borrower. So this is, Bank A wants to lend him money, but then the problem is Bank A ran out of money to lend. They're all their deposits are all loaned out. So then what do they do? Will Bank A just say nicely and courteously, I'm sorry, we apologize, we don't have funds to lend. Can you come back another time? No, this is not possible. They won't turn away a good, potentially, good clients. So what do? They will check on the the Fed funds system, and then they found Bank B, and Bank B happens to have $1 million, and Bank B, that $1 million came from Mr. Y. Okay, and so Bank B will lend money to. So Mr. Y put 1 million. Originally came from Mr. Y, and Bank B lends this 1 million to Bank A at Fed funds rate, and at the Fed funds rate is, let's say, 1%. I mean, just to make it. Fed funds rate is 1%. And usually, Fed funds market is for very short-term overnight lending, because the next day they are out of funds, but the next day, as the bank opens, they will have deposits coming in, other transactions through accounts, receivable and things like that. When the money comes in, they will have 1 million, so they can pay back. So this 1% is, of course, also annualized rate. So borrowing for just overnight, one day, the interest they will pay will be 1/365 of 1%. Make sense? So when Mr. X, so they can pay, they can lend 1 million to Mr. X, but what interest will they charge to Mr. X? 1 million. They will, since Mr. X has an excellent credit rating, right? Safest borrower, he won't pay much more than very, higher than 1%. But the thing is, he will pay about 4%, right? The interest rate will be at, this is, conventional, empirically. Why? Because Mr. X is a prime category client, he will be applied a prime rate. And prime rate it's not etched in stone, right? It's not like Moses' 10 Commandment. There's nothing that says, on a stone plate, thou shalt not charge more than 3%, right? But the thing is, prime rate is conventionally 3% or 3 to 3.5% above the Fed funds rate. So if the Fed funds rate is 1%, the rate that Mr. X will be charged will be 4% because it's, and then so he will pay back, right? 1 million and 40,000, right? So he will pay back 1 million. So let me 1.004 million, right? Oh, 1.04 million. Right, 4% of. So then they will pay back again 1.04 million. Oh no, they don't pay back 1.0. They pay back 1.01 million because it's 1%, right, between the banks, right? So then what does that mean? 3% is Bank A's cut, right? Bank A makes 3%. And then when Mr. X gets his money back, what did I say? The borrowing rate, when the banks borrow, and even when the Fed funds rate is 1%, they only pay you like 0.1%, right? So it's going to be 1.001 million back. It's like $1,001,000. So what does that mean? The bank B makes 0.9%, right? So this is, how it works in the Fed funds market, right? But think about it. Banks get because it's, intra-industry. It's like if you work for Chrysler and if you buy Chrysler car, you get the best price, right? Because it's in-house, right? And you are an employee, you get the employee discount or something like that. So within the industry, commercial banks, they get the preferential rate. And when you might wonder, why doesn't Bank B lend directly to Mr. X and make 3%? Well, Mr. X didn't come to Bank B. And let's say Bank A is in New York, Mr. X is in New York, Bank B may be in the West Coast, Los Angeles, and Mr. Y is in Los Angeles. So Mr. X, of course, the branches are all over, but then Mr. X, it just happened that Mr. X didn't walk into Bank B. Okay? And So this is, basically the Fed funds market, right? And the rate that is, Fed funds rate. Okay, federal funds, right? Fed funds rate, or FFR. All right. So in the next video, we'll discuss why Federal Reserve. I said the answer. The question, is Fed funds market regulated and supervised, governed by the Federal Reserve? I said yes and no, and we'll discuss why that's the case. Okay, I will see you in the next video. Stop recording.